Chapter 34. Up in the Sacred Oaks. Skull's gang rode into the clearing, holding torches that blazed with fire. The scars marking Brunt's face glowed in the torchlight, and Gobbler's running eye gleamed like a beetle. But what frightened Moll most, what made the blood course through her veins, wasn't the two masks lit up beneath the hoods. It was the strange creature that prowled between the shadow masks. It moved like oil, stalking into the clearing with blazing red eyes and a skilled body. It was no bigger than a hound, but the head that hung from its black body was the unmistakable face of an ape. Oak gasped. "It can't be." Moll's face twisted with terror. What is it?" "Cinderella Bull was wrong," Oak said. "Not all of Skull's hounds woke up as harmless strays. This one woke as a..." He gulped. "An altar skin. Witch doctors are known for cursing the spirits of animals in their power. And when they curse their spirits, they shift their appearance too." He paused. "This altar skin will have a mind of pure evil now. It'll do anything Skull commands." Moll clutched Griff tight. Gobbler hurled a torch towards the base of an oak, and its light illuminated his broken smile. "Come out of the trees and fight!" Within seconds, a path of fire had ripped through the undergrowth, and Skull's gang cheered. Oak's gypsies leapt higher within the trees. "Hand over Moll and a wildcat, or we'll see the clearing burn to the ground!" Gobbler shrieked. Skull's boy spread out with Gobbler to face the oaks where the wagons used to stand, but Skull and Hemlock hung back in the centre of the clearing with the altar skin. They didn't need to fight. Their curses were stronger than daggers and torches. The shadow masks' heads were bowed, and their dream snatch flooded Moll's body, tearing through her with thuds of loathing. "We know you're up there, Moll, Pecksniff. You and your wildcat. There's no escaping us now. Give yourself up and this will stop. All of your camp will be spared." Blood pounded in Moll's ears. "Your parents tried to fight us, but what good did it do them? If you don't surrender, we'll kill Oak. We'll torture the women. We'll tear the children apart." Moll gripped the amulet, willing herself to be strong, but it no longer glowed, and hanging around her neck, it looked like nothing more than a small lump of metal. Doubt crept in as the dream snatch beat louder. Perhaps the amulet had never been magical at all. Besides her, Griff was clasping the branch with his claws, shaking his head from side to side. Sensing his panic, Moll stretched out her hand and squeezed his leg. "Fight it with me, Griff." The wildcat burrowed into her chest, his body shuddering. Gobbler and Brunt had lowered another torch to the foot of an oak. Gobbler's hunched back swelled in delight as the flames crawled upwards, crisping the leaves to rust. More gypsies jumped within the branches. "Give Moll and the wildcat up, and your forest will be spared," Gobbler shouted. "What hope have any of you got against the shadow masks? Who's going to answer me that?" And then Jessie emerged, darting out onto the branch of a burning tree. "Sid," he gasped. "Pow!" "I'll answer you that, Gobbler." Jessie hurled down a dagger. It shot through the flames and sliced, keen into Gobbler's neck. Gobbler yelled out in pain, his back humping over his face as he slid down from his cob to the ground. He crawled a few steps towards the edge of the clearing, his running eye wild and wet, and then, after a few moments, he was still. Skull looked up from his chant. "Torch it to the ground," he snarled. Like unseen acrobats, the gypsies leapt within the oaks from branch to branch, from tree to tree. Daggers showered down towards Skull's boys, but they sidestepped on their cobs, hurling their torches at the trees. The clearing blazed an orange, a graveyard of scorched undergrowth. Brunt urged his cob forward towards Jessie's tree. Realising his ma and baby sister would be tucked up with his pa, Siddy fumbled for his catapult and drew it out. Roaring with fury, he pulled back on the pouch. The sharpened stone flew through the air and slammed into Brunt's head. He cried out and tumbled backwards off his cob. 2 more knives hurtled through the air. One slammed into the leg of a tall, lanky boy with ruthless eyes, and the other lodged in the arm of the last of Skull's boys. He had a hunted look, purple curled lips and dark shadows for eyes. The boys fell down off their cobs and stumbled between the roaring flames. Still more daggers showered down towards Skull and Hemlock this time, but they dodged them with a sinister quickness, hanging back to perform their curse. And between them, the altar-skin's red eyes narrowed. Wisdom flung down another dagger, then looked to Oak, who nodded. "Stay here," Oak whispered. "As long as Griff and Alfie are with you, you're safe." And then he shouted out into the clearing, "Down from the trees, men!" Oak's sons, together with Oak, Jessie, and Florence's father, leapt from the burning branches, spilling into the clearing like a raging tide. Mole watched, aghast, as they darted between the flames, brandishing their daggers at Skull's boys. "You're outnumbered and you know it," cried Oak. "We'll spare you so long as you leave the forest and never return." Brunt was fumbling for something inside his waistcoat. Then a pistol gleamed in the flames. "Let them have it, boys," he bellowed. Several gunshots cracked into the air. "Wisdom, Jessie!" Oak roared. "Use your guns to wound, not kill!" Mole watched in horror, and yet, as she watched, the figures, the flames, and the cobs were all becoming a blur. She felt the heat from the fire burn inside her. Growing with Skull and Hemlock's chant, her grip on the branch loosened, her balance wobbled, but Alfie seized hold of her. Beside them, Griff's fur was wet with sweat and his eyes were wild. But Mole was oblivious to Griff now. All she could feel, all she could hear, was the dream snatch clamouring in her ears. "Leave Tanglefern," Oak yelled from below, "and we'll spare you." Skull's boys fought on, blind to Oak's words. Oak jammed his leg into Brunt's hand. The pistol dropped from Brunt's grasp, but he lashed out blindly with his dagger. Oak leapt backwards, then raised his own dagger. Jessie scampered forward and grabbed the fallen pistol from the ground. He raised it up, taking aim at another boy, but the boy ducked behind a tree. Brunt jabbed his dagger at Oak's face. Oak jerked aside, but the blade snicked his cheek. Blood trickled down to his jaw, yet still Oak jumped forward. Brunt was quick and he leapt aside, but Oak was quicker. He brought his dagger down onto Brunt's arm and it sliced through his clothing. Brunt howled with pain. Oak drew out his pistol. "Leave!" he roared, "or we'll shoot you all dead." Brunt's eyes were wide with fear and he faltered backwards. His jaw was shaking, but he raised his dagger again. Oak fired 2 shots into the ground before Brunt's feet. They ricocheted off a fallen branch and spattered against Brunt's shins. Brunt's legs buckled beneath him and he cried out. He looked at the dagger in his hand. Blood had dribbled down from the wound in his arm and was now smeared over the handle. Grimacing, he let the dagger fall to the ground and clutching his arm to his chest, he limped away, out of the clearing and into the darkness. "Come back!" Skull roared, but Brunt had already disappeared into the forest. "He won't come back for you," Oak cried to the last of Skull's boys. "Leave, and we won't fight you any more. Find other lodgings and work. Skull's dealing in a magic far darker than you realise." Skull's boys stumbled backwards, clutching their wounds. Bent double and fighting for breath, they looked at each other with panic-stricken faces. Oak's men gathered together in a cloud of anger, shouting and wielding their weapons, beaten and bloodied. Skull's boys heaved themselves away from the clearing. Skull and Hemlock kicked their cobs in pursuit of the boys, howling for them to return. The soul splinter's been summoned, Skull shouted after them. You want to miss out on dark magic like that? The altar skin flicked a glance up to the very branch Mole crouched on, then followed. Mole blinked several times, trying to understand what she was seeing. They were winning, surely. But then, why did everything in her body tell her that Skull and Hemlock were stronger than all of this? The shadow masks were lost in the trees for a moment, and in the commotion, no one noticed Gobbler's misshapen body haul itself up with a gun and take aim at the back of Oak's head. No one, except Alfie. The barrels of Gobbler's gun loomed like tunnelled eyes, but Alfie's arm shot back, and with one eye closed he hurled his dagger. It spun through the air, a glint of leather and metal, and sunk into Gobbler's hand. The gun fell to the ground, and Gobbler edged backwards, cursing. Alfie's eyes widened in shock as he realised what he'd done. As Alfie's camp fought to quell the flames, Skull tore back into the clearing, pausing for a second by Gobbler. "Help me," Gobbler rasped, and Skull fired his pistol into Gobbler's heart. He raised a cloaked arm and pointed at the branch Mole and Griff crouched on. "That one," he hissed. Then he turned from the clearing and rode back towards the deep wood. Mole shook her head, burying it in her knees. "They're calling for me, Alfie. Make it stop." Beside her, Griff clung to the branch, his whiskers trembling, his growl weakened to a whimper. Then he threw his head back and yelped. Alfie held Mole by the shoulders. "They've gone, Mole. It's just us." Mole shook her head, her body rigid with fear. "They're here, Alfie, they're here." She shuffled nearer to him. And, like ghosts in the darkness, Hemlock and the altar skin waited, stitched into the shadows beneath the sacred oak. "We know you're up there, Mole, with your wildcat. We can feel you. We can hear you breathing. Give yourselves up." "Can you hear it?" Mole whispered, her eyes wide. But before Alfie could answer, something black and sinuous bolted up the tree towards Mole. Griff leapt in front of her, his claws splayed. The altar skin's red eyes throbbed and its skilled limbs thrashed out at Griff. Mole scuttled backwards, pressing herself against the tree trunk with Alfie. Griff yelped in pain as the altar skin's claws sank into his fur. Then he twisted free, gnashing his teeth, lashing at the ape-like face with razored talons. The altar skin bellowed in anger and hurled itself at the wildcat. Time shrieked to a halt. Mole caught Griff's terrified eyes just as he fell from the tree, limbs scrabbling. The altar skin hurtled to the ground after him. "Griff!" Mole yelled. Griff darted away from the altar skin, but a neck shot out from the shadows, hissing through the air. It whipped against Griff's face, and he swerved left into the clutches of the altar skin. Mole struggled against Alfie, feeling Griff's pain tugging her inside her. "Griff!" she yelled again, her eyes filling with tears. "If you go after him, the shadow masks get you both," Alfie shouted. Hemlock slid out of the shadows, hurling the net again. It sucked Griff backwards, cutting into his fur, snarling, spitting, tearing at the ropes with his teeth. Griff fought inside the net. The altar skin thumped a claw on Griff's back, and Hemlock pulled the net tighter, strapping the ropes to his cob. Oak and his men were rushing towards Hemlock now, but he leapt onto his cob and spurred it on, back towards the deep wood with the altar skin. Mole twisted and shrieked within Alfie's grasp. "No, not Griff!" she howled, great sobs ripping through her body. Jesse fired his pistol at the altar skin. It stumbled, and then he fired again and again until it slumped down, dead. But Hemlock rode on, wrenching Griff further and further away from the clearing.